Yeah, with that, we'll turn it over to David for his talk on spirituality and the evolution of religion and morality. So, David, thank you for agreeing to give this talk to us.
Well, of course, and I think that this is a continuing of this conversation. It's very much a sketch, and I'm going to hopefully kept it short for lots of Q&A. So let's just go into it. I want to begin with a memorable conversation I had with the British philosopher Simon Blackburn. And I began the conversation by saying, Simon, define morality for me, describe it for me as you would in an introductory philosophy course, not from an evolutionary perspective. Just what's morality, please? And he said, I think at its simplest, it's a system whereby we put pressure on ourselves and others to conform to certain kinds of behaviors. That's the side of morality that is perhaps most obviously associated with rules, with boundaries to conduct, with limiting criminal behavior, and when rules are transgressed. On top of that, there's an element of morality that is concerned more with our sentiments and emotions. For example, with sympathy and our capacity to feel sympathy at others' distress and a corresponding motivation to do something about it. So there's two sides to morality, one more coercive and the second more gentle and humane. So that's how we define morality without reference to evolution. And I just love that because it's exactly what you would expect from an evolutionary perspective. So what seems to be axiomatic about morality, what any moral philosopher will tell you, is that moral systems are somehow designed for the good of the group defined as within the moral circle, that there's a compulsory component and there's a voluntary component. So when I describe human evolution, and these are some of my stock slides that I use whenever I do, I describe it as a major evolutionary transition. I think most people on this call know what that means. There's a huge difference between the social lives of chimpanzees and humans. Naked aggression is over 100 times more frequent in a chimp community than a human community. And the difference is because of the strong social control mechanisms in humans that suppress bullying and other forms of disruptive self-serving behaviors. Two books on this topic are by Christopher Bohm and by Richard Wrangham. Christopher Bohm calls it reverse dominance. In a chimp colony, the biggest, meanest individuals get to bully the others. Even cooperation takes the form of alliances competing with other alliances within the same community. The main context for community-wide cooperation is competition with other chimp communities. But in a human group, if a bully tries to get their way, then they are typically effectively suppressed by everybody else. And so in the cover of Richard Wrangham's book, you see the big guy there, he's been X'd out. And Wrangham makes the point that capital punishment was very important. Thank you very much. I mean, it's a little bit creepy to think of it, but that throughout history, people that just couldn't get along were incorrigible, they were killed. And so that's a part of the story. And that's why it's such a good paradox, is that goodness within groups is joined at the hip with social control within groups, and of course, often with competitive interactions among other groups. And so human moral systems are like an immune system. I'm going to return to that, protecting against cancerous selfish behaviors. This doesn't mean that selfish behaviors are eliminated. Like the immune system, human moral systems are always operating, often challenged and sometimes overcome. So there always is a cancerous side to human nature. Most people are willing to game the system or ready to game the system when possible. And so from a multi-level perspective, this social control has the effect of suppressing within group selection so that between group selection becomes the dominant evolutionary force. That's the definition of a major transition. And it explains just about everything that's distinctively human can be seen as a form of cooperation, both physical and mental. And our capacity for cultural evolution is elaborated form of mental cooperation. So we have cooperation to thank and a major transition to thank for just the existence of a cultural stream of inheritance in our species. And so that's why these two dimensions of morality must go together. The compulsory dimension makes it safe to express the voluntary dimension. Without the compulsory dimension, the voluntary dimension would be too easily exploited. So that accounts for the two faces of morality that Blackburn was discussing. And so, so a little more on this metaphor of the immune system, because now we're using it in a somewhat different way than the way Andy developed it last week. And so in this rendering of moral systems as like an immune system, in the analogy, the cooperative group is the organism, and the parasite is disruptive self-serving behaviors, cheating behaviors. A very strong analogy with cancer. This book by Athena Actifus, The Cheating Cell, basically describes cancer cells as cheaters in a cooperative organism. And so the immune system of the moral system has to do with norms, monitoring, punishment, exclusion. That's the immune response. Us-them thinking is really essential. When you imagine that multiple human groups are interacting with each other and they each have their own way of doing things, then something like speciation is required. There has to be some sense in which the culture has a sense of self-recognition, any particular group, in terms of the way that they go about doing things, and differentiates themselves with them, even if they're not hostile interactions, just to preserve the culture for that group. And so thinking of cultural isolating mechanisms as like species genetic isolating mechanisms is very provocative. And this whole rendering is agnostic on the role of factual realism. In Andy's formulation last week, the parasite was some disinformation, and we need to protect ourselves from disinformation. This is different, I think, and it's different in a way that we all need to think about. So the disruption of cooperation is the criterion for parasitic behavior, not distortions of actual, not disinformation per se. In real world moral systems, the immune response to cheating frequently includes distortions of factual reality, as we'll see in the case of religion. So we have two concepts of cultural immune systems here, and I just think that we need more work to reconcile them. I'm not going to claim to do so here, just to kind of leave it as an area of inquiry for ourselves. Okay, so there's my sketch of morality. Now let's turn to religion. And I'm long been fascinated that there's two definitions of religion, two major definitions. One is Durkheim, which is all about moral communities, a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things which unite into one single moral community called a church, all those to adhere to them. So all about community organized around the concept of the sacred. The second definition, of course, is centered on belief in supernatural agents. And these definitions are orthogonal to others. It's possible to imagine plus or minus for each of them. We could have something which involves belief in supernatural agents, but doesn't lead to community, like the flying spaghetti monster. And we can imagine something which is highly communitarian and doesn't invoke the gods. And so plus and minus for either. When we study religion from an evolutionary perspective, we can use the kind of decision tree that's used for the explanation of all traits. So for any trait that we're considering, we want to know, is it an adaptation? Is it a product of selection or not? So Is it an adaptation or not an adaptation? If it's an adaptation, what's the level of selection? Did it evolve by by virtue of groups surviving and reproducing better than other groups, individuals compared to other individuals within groups? And might it be a cultural parasite, something which is infective and spreads without benefiting either individuals or groups? That is one of the possibilities. If it's not adaptive in any sense, it might be a byproduct of an adaptation, a spandrel. It could be a mismatch, adapted in the past but not the present, or it could be a product of cultural drift. So this is the decisions we must make for any trait, and we must make them for the many traits associated with religion. Many byproduct and mismatch theories of religion have been proposed. Not always from an explicit evolutionary perspective, by the way. For example, there's an economic theory of religion proposed by Rodney Stark, which is a byproduct theory, but stated in economic terms. But the evolutionists that we know of are Dawkins, Dennett, Boyer, Atran, and so forth. The so-called hyperactive agency detector model is basically explains belief in supernatural agents as a kind of, from signal detection theory, as a kind of a misclassification. These are not mutually exclusive, and many traits are associated with religion, so examples of all can be found. But in the 20 years of research on this, or the last 20 years of research, a consensus has been reached that basically Durkheim was on the right track with his emphasis on moral communities and with a high degree of secular utility, appearances notwithstanding. And so here's an assessment of my book, Darwin's Cathedral, 15 years later. It was not until I published Darwin's Cathedral that evolutionary studies of religion appears to have passed a Rubicon. Wilson argued that religions evolved because it benefits groups. In other words, religion is a group level adaptation, I think. And this has become a consensus. So what does it mean to say that that groups are impressively adapted at the group level? If you look at biological organisms, you find that they're impressively flexible. They have their behavior is a big if-then statement. If in this situation, do this. In that situation, do that. That's called adaptive phenotypic plasticity. And that's what we find true of well-adapted cultures that are well-adapted at the group level. I presented many examples in Darwin's Cathedral. I had a whole chapter on Calvinism in its origin as a religion that was actually adapted to the ecology of a particular city, the city of Geneva. I have a chapter on forgiveness as a complex adaptation. Religion, Christianity doesn't instruct us to turn the other cheek. It's much more nuanced than that as to how we respond to various forms of transgression. It provides a dense if-then framework, basically, for when and where to be forgiving. A wonderful example from Steve Lansing on the water temple system of Bali, a religion that's designed to orchestrate rice agriculture and a trade-off between pest control and water irrigation. That's the point. Something as mundane as rice agriculture being managed by something as seemingly otherworldly as religion. And after writing Darwin's Cathedral, I did another study, which was studying a random sample of religions chosen from an encyclopedia of religions. And so now I wasn't cherry picking examples, I was studying a random sample. And the evidence for their secular utility was just overwhelming. And that included Jainism, which is included in my sample and which superficially was the most challenging to explain from a group level functional perspective. But the Jains, it's one of the most ascetic religions. Jain renunciates have no belongings, they're homeless, they go from household to household with their bowls for food. They have a custom of fasting themselves to the death. And so if ever there was a parasitic religion, a religion parasitic on humans, you'd think it would be that one. But if come to learn about it, in this book by James Laidlaw, whose title says it all, Riches and Renunciation, we learn that actually the renunciates, the ascetics, are a tiny fraction of the whole Jain religion, whose lay members are among the wealthiest merchants of India. And he does a wonderful job explaining Jainism as basically a religion that's adapted, much like Judaism in Europe and middleman societies all over the world, adapted to a particular economic niche. And the ascetics play a vital role in the religion as a moral police force, basically. Just amazing example of how this religion functions in a certain ecology. And then here's a final study that we've done. This was with my work with my former grad student, Yasha Hartberg, in which we studied sacred text as a kind of a cultural genome. There's intriguing similarities. Sacred texts are replicated across generations with high fidelity. They have a segmented structure. And then what happens on an average Sunday is that somebody invokes passages that are apropos to the situation, and that influences behavior. So this is something like gene expression. And so what we did to kind of turn this into a method was we took two churches that are very different. So here's the paradox. How is it possible that churches such as a conservative church like the Westboro Baptist Church is highly conservative? Here's another congregation that's highly progressive, open, and affirming. How can they be so different from each other when they're drawing upon the same sacred text? And so we got biblical citations from sermons, which were available on their websites. And what we find is that they're invoking different books of the Bible. These are heat maps. So the extent to which a book is cited in the sermons that's the extent to which the book glows red here. And we can take a particular book, let's say the book of John, and we can look at the chapters, and we see that once again, the two different congregations are citing different chapters of John. And then we can go to a particular chapter like John 3, and we can see that actually they're citing one verse in common. What verse is that? It's the famous John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. So that's quoted frequently by both churches, but in terms of how they interpret that passage, then that's very different. And we showed that the text in the Westboro Baptist Church was much stronger in anger than in the progressive church. So just in the same way that that different cells of our body have the same genes, but they're differentially expressed, here we have two congregations that are very, very different in how they behave based on differential activation of different passages in the Bible. So we took this further. This is the time when I was studying congregations in my city of Binghamton, New York. And what we found is that all denominations, all major Protestant denominations actually vary on an axis from liberal to progressives. And so here we have the United Methodist Church, two different congregations 10 miles apart from each other in the city of Binghamton. One happened to be more progressive than the other. And so we did a similar analysis, and we find that the conservative church in Binghamton has a kind of a profile, a heat map quite similar to the Westboro Baptist Church. So there's a family resemblance basically between the two conservative and the two progressive churches. And we've expanded the sample a little bit to show that there's these family resemblances between these different interpretations of religion. So to summarize, 20 years of evolutionary religious studies have led to a neo-Durkheimian interpretation of religion. This provides a theoretical foundation for religious groups as adaptive units that the original tradition of functionalism didn't have. The Durkheimian tradition deserved to be rejected in many respects. This is not simply a return to Durkheim. This is a much stronger foundation for the concept of human groups as adaptive units. The evolutionary foundation is quite capable of identifying exceptions to the rules. Many of examples of religions that were corrupted, as it's often put, and so basically are now working for the benefit of some, usually the elites, at the expense of others. The whole Protestant Reformation formed because of corruption in the Catholic Church. And so religions provide an excellent opportunity to study how adaptive fictions are woven into the adaptive design of groups. But adaptive fictions are by no means restricted to religion. I love to cite this book by Hobsbawm and Ranger, The Invention of Tradition, which shows that how cultures imagine their past is at least as consequential for action as how they imagine their gods. And so nearly every culture invents and attributes much more antiquity to its traditions than is the case, as any competent historian can show. And chapter after chapter of this book, beginning with Scotland, shows how much these traditions are just invented out of whole cloth and are basically the same kind of adaptive fictions as supernatural agents. Jonathan Gottschall's book, The Storytelling Animal, I think has other examples. And so storytelling is such a deep part of human nature and culture, and inherently involves fictional elements. For example, how most people consider themselves above average. That's an adaptive fiction that we find very useful, very hard to do without. It would compromise our functioning if we were to just imagine ourselves otherwise. Okay, so to finish my sketch with spirituality, here is a list of what's called universal elements of spirituality by a contemplative named Wayne Teasdale. And so if you look at this list, it's a little bit like Simon Blackburn describing morality without reference to religion. I think that we could find that what's axiomatic about spirituality is that it axiomatically recognizes the individual as part of something larger than itself, a willingness to subordinate one's self-interest to a higher good. So key words associated with spirituality, such as sacred and worship, straightforwardly make sense as the psychology of an individual within the group organism. This is how we are programmed to think, you might say, in situations where we are functioning in the context of a highly cooperative group. Just like Durkheim's definition of religion, this view of spirituality is orthogonal with belief in supernatural agents. That means that a person or a group can be highly spiritual and at the same time highly respectful of scientific knowledge. This, I think, if we think of a group whose members have a highly spiritual orientation, how well would they function as a group compared to other individuals who are more profane in their reasoning, think primarily in terms of their self-interest and are prepared to cooperate only to the degree that they can see that benefits themselves. They'll cooperate to a degree, but which group is likely to work better? So it's a testable hypothesis that groups with a strong spiritual orientation will actually function better as groups. Okay, so I think that I have provided my sketch. And now happy to have a discussion.
Thanks, David. I got my hand up first, so I'll just thank you and say, just like last week, I'll let you kind of moderate this. I don't need to be stepping in and doing that. But I'll ask a quick question to kind of relate this to what we're doing with pro-social and CDPs. You talked about the secular utility of these religions, that there are finding benefits for them. That's obviously a very broad statement. I was wondering how specific you could dive into. There are benefits, there are costs. You could maybe consider them within as benefiting each of Lynn Ostrom's 8 CDPs. And we might see costs in particular at the CDP 8 level, with in terms of interacting with other groups outside of them at other levels. That might be an interesting way to go. I'm wondering if that's been done at all. Like, how fine-grained have you been trying to measure benefits and costs of religions in the past, and what's left to look into?
Well, one point to make, Ed, is that everything I said about religion applies to any enduring cultural forms. There's cultural diversity, and then there is what we call religions nested within cultural diversity. And I really think it's important to study meaning systems in general, and then religion and spirituality is one kind of meaning system. So then this approach could be applied to any other form. And I think it is the case that when you look at the core design principles, and this is how we describe them, is a miniature major transition for a group. Implementing the core design principles is equivalent to having a strong moral system for that group. So that's the general way that I think about it. That could be applied at all scales. And does that answer your question, Ed, or do you want to just come back and for anything I didn't?
Yeah, I guess I was hoping for more details of how you came to the conclusion that when you did the random selection of religions and found that even Jainism was considered a benefit to the group. There was obviously some cost and trade-off. How do you do the calculus in order to come up with and say, yes, this is a benefit?
Well, there, I think that first of all, it begins at the kind of the narrative level, or you might say the ethnographic level. So what do we make of these renunciates? Are these some kind of byproduct? It's not benefiting them. I mean, they're not having any children. They're sometimes starving to death in a ritual fast. How could this be explained as anything other than parasitic? And what you learn just from an ethnography, like an anthropological ethnography, is that when the renunciates go from household to household begging for food, their food restrictions are so great that they have to inspect the household minutely for moral purity before they can accept food from the household. And so it's actually a matter of great concern when a renunciate heads towards your house. And I was actually going to quote passages from that book because it's so amazing how they come into the house and they sharply question everyone, especially the women, for their purity and including food preparation. And only when the household is past inspection do the Jains accept food. And this is all public, because when the Jains leave, then you know whether or not they've affected the food. And the ecology behind this is an economic niche, which is the same niche that's held in middleman merchant societies around the world. And so the Jains are involved in the gem trade, for example. And this is a very volatile market that requires a high degree of trust among trading partners. And so the religion is basically this guarantor of trust. So I guess the point is that at this level, what we have is a detailed description of the culture. And that's what I was in the random sample. That's what all I had to go on. And by the way, that's all Eleanor Ostrom had to go on, was descriptive accounts, ethnographic accounts of common pool resource groups, which were good enough to basically identify the presence or absence of the core design principles. And as a final point, to get on to the other questions, so something I did with Ostrom, working with her, in addition to generalizing the core design principles with some of our students, and Yasha was one of the students, we went back to some of her case studies and we asked the question, to what extent was religion involved in the implementation of the core design principles in the common pool resource groups? And very often it was. I mean, the forest was a sacred forest. So CDP 1 was religiously, and punishment was religiously. And so there was a lot of religion in the core design principles. Marcia.
You're muted, Marcia.
I just read an interesting article in Sojourner, which about a professor at Northwestern's looking at African-American churches, Latinic churches, and white churches, and then giving them different scriptures to talk about or choose. And it turned out that when they had passages that had to do with stranger, poor, foreigner, outsider, the white churches had absolutely no interest in those and had not used those scriptures for any period of time, whereas the African-American would. And I'm not sure, I'll try to get the details of where this is, but they ended up saying that almost 2/3 of white churches are more interested in being white than they are being Christian, which I thought was sort of talks about the different ways groups can evolve, still being of service to themselves, but not necessarily and splitting into smaller groups. That's all.
Yeah, and I'm reminded of a wonderful book I read when I was actively studying religion called Streets of Glory. And it was about a neighborhood of Boston that just had so many Black churches, storefront churches. And so why was there this like religious efflorescence there? And the answer was that actually the Black community in Boston is very diverse. There's some Blacks that have been Boston residents for generations. There's some Blacks from the Caribbean. There's some Blacks from Virginia or Louisiana, and they're forming communities. So this is, once again, the communitarian aspect of this is the overriding aspect. And so if a church is going to be diverse, that has to be one of its objectives. It has to be a virtue, a norm, to be a diverse a church. So hold on, are we having a hard time with this?
And it proves your.
Eric is going to get to that. But
Just one thing, it proves his point that evolution's messy, because the white churches are evolving in one direction that we don't think is so appropriate. The Black churches are evolving in another direction. So it's messy.
I mean, it proves the point of multi-level selection, that adaptation at one level gets disruptive at a higher level, and a church can do a great job of organizing itself, but it can be the problem higher up the scale. That's true with all groups. So yeah, it illustrates all these points. Eric.
For my actual question, or for I noticed you were looking at the comment there that it's sort of two different things. I can address my question though, if that's.
If you read your comment, anything you like, Eric, but if you just speak your comments, because I don't.
All right, well, I'll actually go to my question first, because that's more on my mind. But I'm having a hard time formulating it. Is it possible to put up, I think the last or maybe the second last slide on spirituality with scientific, whatever. It flipped so quickly that I wasn't able to process it for my question completely.
Sure, let me get it up. I have to bring it back up.
Sorry. My mind's slow.
Let's see, here we go.
Yeah, that way you don't gotta go all the way back there.
maybe the next 28, slide 28, maybe. A person or group can be highly spiritual. Okay, so I think it is centered around the second one. A person or group can be highly spiritual and also highly respectful of scientific knowledge. You define spirituality as seeing, like being aligned with things that are higher, like a common good or higher at a higher level. I think the slide before this, how did you define spirituality? Or then maybe the next slide. Yeah, something larger than itself. Is there a dichotomy there between spirituality and science? I think with science, can you not, I mean, in many ways, use scientific theories, etc., to feel like you're part of something larger than yourself? Is there? I'm having a hard time formulating the question, but something along those lines, I guess.
I guess you could have a spiritual attitude towards science. And I think, I've gotten into trouble with my atheist colleagues by saying that science is a religion that worships truth as its God. But I think that there's a sense in which there's very much a case that there's a good in science. It is the pursuit of objective of realities, and that's a higher good. So all of the key words associated with spirituality, such as sacred and worship and so on, are used in everyday language. I think the reason that environmentalism, such as deep ecology, has a spiritual hue is that people feel Gaia. I mean, I think that the welfare of the earth is the most important thing that there can be. I subordinate myself to that. I regard it as sacred. And so therefore, that would be a spiritual attitude, state of mind, which does not invoke supernatural agency and doesn't need to, is what I was trying to say. And so it's not as if you have to check your brains at the door to be spiritual. You can
Thank you.
Jordan.
Yeah, so I have two questions. The first one's very brief. I'll just put it out there. Are humans a worshiping animal, and is that unique to humans? That's the first question. Like, is that part of us? And I would say I would look at that in terms of both religions, in terms of what we think of religions, but also what you've called stealth religions, making meaning through adaptive fictions. So that's the first question: are we uniquely a worshiping animal? And then the second one has to do, I've wanted to ask you this for a while, between competition and cooperation. It seems like so much of, when we talk about pro-social, we're talking about how to cooperate more and not be as competitive. And yet it seems to me that they are kind of the same thing depending on what level you're looking at. So a religion that's cooperating with each other are competing, whether they know it or not, against another religion or another culture. And so I'm wondering, is that true? Am I thinking about that correctly, that competition and cooperation are actually the same thing, just depending on what level you're looking at?
So in the first place, I think that insofar as we're the only species that has a full-blown cultural inheritance system based on symbolic thought, that you could say that we're the only species that worships. And Terry Deacon had a really nice phrase that I've begun to adopt, that humans are a symbolically eusocial species, a symbolically eusocial species. So the social glue for a social insect colony is kinship, let us say crudely. But the social glue for a human group is their symbolic systems. And Teilhard de Chardin appreciated that long ago when he talked about the extraordinarily agglutinative property of symbolic thought. So you could say we're the only symbolically eusocial species, and I think that's like super interesting to just to play with, just to play with that. And absolutely, I mean, multi-level selection is all, well, in the first place, and Darwin said this also, that he meant competition in a large and metaphorical sense. If cultural change occurs, or if genetic change occurs also, or any change occurs, that has to be some things replacing other things. And so change is competition in that very, very broad sense. And so when cooperation evolves at one level, it's replacing less cooperative forms at that level. So they always go hand in hand. And then it's a matter of what the criterion of selection is. So if we want global cooperation, for example, we need to actively select for it. And the competition there's only one Earth, but the competition that's taking place is between different sets of practices that are more or less cooperative at that scale. So it's possible to have competition take place at the scale of the whole Earth in terms of the alternative futures that we imagine for it. That's where the competition takes place. I don't know if that's, so let's continue here. Andy.
Yeah, when I was really young, I asked my mum, if there's only one God, why are there so many churches? I'm still trying to answer that one. What's interesting is, in a similar way, scripture doesn't change particularly fast. Wycliffe got burnt at the stake, I think, for translating it into English. The scripture kind of is static, but the word context actually comes from the practice of writing notes alongside the main text, along the scripture, giving a means by which to interpret the main text, context with text. Now, what it seems is that the scripture itself is fairly stable, but we're getting the equivalent of epigenetic expression here, which is forming different kinds of religious groups, a kind of theodiversity, which is going on, and different combinations of these expressions seem to be befitting of an some kind of theological niche, the theological marketplace, I've heard it called. What I found was, I did it on phonetic traits, outward expressions of Western Christian denominations, things like how many sacraments do they have? Do they believe in tulip, the Calvinistic thing? All these kinds of things. And that produced very much a nice theodiversity. But what was interesting was when I compared it to a genetic tree, not a genetic tree, a family tree, a genealogical tree of the schisms of various branches and denominations, the actual expressions seem to match the denomination, the actual descent. So it appeared as though there was a form of inheritance going on between these things as they schismed and split. Have you done any equivalent to phylogenetic analysis on the expressions of different parts of the Bible?
Well, I mean, there's a lot more that needs to be done, and I think that religious cultural evolution is a lot more reticulate than a sort of a bifurcation. For example, if you look at Christianity and Judaism, on one hand, Christianity is derived from Judaism, but on the other hand, they've been co-evolving for so long that they've been trading traits back and forth. throughout their existence, and so you have to factor that into account. But in my random sample, we found that most new religions were formed because there was some segment of the population that was not being well served by the current religions. And so that was the impetus for forming a new religion, with some population that was better served by the new religion. And of course, that was true for the Protestant Reformation. And if you look at the Protestant Reformation, I think would be as good a place as any to study that in detail. And there you find, like, not to spend too long on it, but I mean, it was totally fascinating. And one of the things I found was that the depth of religious scholarship is just insane. I mean, there's so much detail that you can then interpret from a natural history standpoint. And so you had, for example, so many things taking place in just about every city in Europe. There was a different version of Protestantism unfolding. Some hung together, like Calvinism, some fell apart, like Zwingli's version in Bergen. We had the Anabaptists that were squelched in Europe, but then they migrated to North America. And so it's this whole kind of field of cultural evolution in which there's an intended component. In many respects, the people like Calvin were just like consciously trying to invent a religion that's adapted to their circumstance. And then there was this huge unintended component on top of it, as different intentions collided with each other and so on. So when it comes to like whether human cultural evolution is consciously directed or not, it's both, and both in a really interesting way. So I mean, there's much to say about this, but anyhow, this is a sketch, and so I think one thing we should be thinking is, how do we pursue this line of inquiry? What are the interesting directions that we might like to take as we move forward with our project here? As we multiply our projects, what would we like to do? A separate group could be devoted to, during the second generation, for example, we could be concentrating on some of these interesting questions. Andy.
Okay, thanks.
David, apologies first for the late arrival. Couldn't be helped, but really impressive talk for the part I heard. I so much to think about there. Help me think this through. When I hear the words like adaptive and pro-social, I tend to hear those as positive terms that I want to attach a positive valence to. But when you say things like, a trait can be adaptive at one level of organization, but work against fitness at another level. I mean, that seems right to me, but it also makes me wonder whether you can apply the term adaptive straightforwardly. So think about, for example, the Christian nationalism that's spreading through America right now. Many of these Christian it clearly seems adaptive in the sense that it's capturing people's minds and hearts and drawing them into the Christian nationalist movement. But it's also leading many of those folks to sort of reject some of the core principles of American secularism. In fact, I believe the Texas legislature right now is contemplating a motion to secede from the Union so that they can create a Christian nation of Texas right now. Belief systems like that seem to be adaptive in one sense, but yet utterly maladaptive or problematic in another sense. So I'm wondering if I need to rethink my reflexive tendency to attribute, to place a positive valence on adaptive. And I wonder if the same is true of the term pro-social.
Yeah, Andy, thanks for that. And I think that whenever we have our evolution hat on, we need to use the word adaptive and the way evolutionary biologists do, and then apply that to culture. And if you look within evolutionary biology, then it's clear that, for example, if you looked at the adaptations of any species, pick anyone you want, pick beavers, then the properties of beavers are based on anything that helps beavers survive and reproduce better than other beavers. And that has consequences. It has consequences for the whole ecosystem, especially in the case of beavers. But that doesn't mean that what goes on at the ecosystem level is adaptive. There's no sense in which that's helping nutrients recycle better or favoring biodiversity or no. I mean, it's like laissez-faire. It's like in a laissez-faire economy, if a company's maximizing its profit, it's adaptive in that sense. And it's displacing other companies. And that's the only sense that evolutionists ever mean for a species. The question as to whether and when ecosystems function well as ecosystems it's a great question. And it turns out only when ecosystems are the unit of selection is the answer to that question. That's why our microbiomes work well for us, is because whenever we live and die, our microbiomes live and die with us. There's a selection process at that level. And so, I mean, the lesson of multi-level selection, which is the lesson people should take from George Williams's book, Adaptation and Natural Selection, is no adaptation without a process of selection at that level. Don't ever expect a group to be adaptive unless selection is taking place at the level of that group. And so we have to see both function and dysfunction. And then we have to use it whenever we have our evolution hat on. We need to be using it in that sense. But then when we put on another hat, which is a normative hat, then we have to say, no, this thing that's happening is pathological. I'm in the arms industry, the big pharma, the food industry. These are all pathological at the level of the whole system, not adaptive at all. But the reason that it happened is because of a selection process, which caused those things to evolve compared to other things. And if we want to bring them about, then we have to alter that selective environment. So I think it's like not just important, it is like the essence of the essence that we see everything around us as adaptive or not, as the evolutionists use the word, and then relate that to our normative concept of adaptation. That to me is like of the essence.
Thank you.
Barry.
I was going to comment on earlier. I think it was Eric that commented on, when it comes to science and then spirituality. Me personally, I feel like I'm a perfect example of somebody who, through a chaotic circumstance, was seeking truth through science, and then arose at a spiritual perspective of the whole thing that I call an evolutionary. That's why, for me, everything we're talking about, the most effective way that I try to teach evolution is in a spiritual way, because I believe once you understand deeply the evolutionary worldview and major evolutionary transitions, even an atheist will start to be moved, that bothered by, they're starting to see some meaning here in their mind. They might put it off, and then they see some meandering and then more movement towards complexity, order, and intelligence. And this goes all the way on up to where we are here. We are cultures, we're seeing this. So how do you continue to just displace that, forget that? To me, that is the universe. and it's written into it, and it's a state of becoming, and life is in a state of becoming, and we are one with it. And I believe in it. And I believe in science, and we're discovering all these things that are in the state of becoming. And when you feel that deeply, this isn't just a scientific belief of facts, but this is your heart, and you're ready to put your energy and your life and your time for it because it's bigger than you. And it allows somebody who started off completely atheistic to become completely spiritual and scientific at the same time. And that's why I'm here. And I believe that is going to be the force that will change this world, because when everybody can believe all the things we understand in science and be completely moved like I am spiritually, there will be no force in this world that can change what we're going to do. And it's going to happen. You will see.
Spoken as a true preacher.
Testify, Brother Greg.
Testify. No, and it's so interesting. You know, I think that is, I can't find anything wrong with that. I can't, and there's a whole tribe of people called the evolutionary leaders that are kind of striving in that direction. And Teilhard de Chardin was among the first. And if you read him, and I've been working a lot lately, basically reintroducing him to a modern audience. One thing you find, and Gary, you're very eloquent, of course, not just, I mean, more than eloquent, is that in the various efforts to do this, the narratives that are, I mean, I don't know, there's so much to say about this that maybe I'll just defer it because we're at the end of our hour. So let me get to Eric. But there's a whole big swath here that we need to consider, and so I hope that we do. Those of us that are especially interested in it. Eric, you can, I think, maybe have the final word.
Thank you. So I'm wondering if there's any genetic markers or genetic genetic like signs that evolution on the ecological level have taken place. So for example, like I maybe I'm wrong and you can correct me on this, but I feel like social needs, like the need to feel connected and in love, I feel like those most likely would have evolved on the group level, maybe like the human social group level, a group level trait to genetically predispose us to feel pleasure and suffering when those needs are fulfilled or not. But for example, Maslow and more recently Scott Barry Kaufman have talked about a need to transcend, which I also feel is sort of, in a sense, a spiritual need in some ways. But I wonder if possibly, or if it's naive to think about it, but maybe a hypothesis is that this need might have evolved genetically through ecosystem level selection. Is that plausible in any sense?
Well, I think it is plausible. I think that's what we're saying. And we also have Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl, which is cited again and again. And the more we take cultural evolution seriously, and the more we take cultural evolution at the group level seriously, then these things, and we really have to wean ourselves from almost a century of individualism and reductionism. And so to think that a search for meaning, a search to be part of something larger than ourselves, indeed are products of genetic evolution. And when they emerge most naturally, spontaneously, even without the need for culture at all, is in life and death emergency situations. If you take a group of people and you put them in a highly dysphoric situation, then they click into this mode automatically. And my favorite example of that, it's actually an example that ended my book with Elliot Sober, Unto Others, was a short story by Stephen Crane called The Open Boat, based on a real life experience in which he was on a ship that sank. And so he found himself in a tiny dinghy with the 3 other people rowing for shore through stormy seas. And, you know, I mean, he could have just thought about that. I'll do whatever I can to save my skin. He didn't have to have feelings of love for his fellow people. They were strangers before that moment. But what he comments in the story is the love that he felt for them. And he described it as the best time of his life, when in all other respects, it was the worst time of his life. And so what this calls for is, what these emergency group level situations call for, is just flipping people into that psychological state. And much that happens culturally is actually simulating that or replicating that. Like if you look at rituals, just for why is it that fraternities, for example, have these hazing rituals, and so many cultures have painful rituals? Because the people that go through it are bonded by the experience. The culture has manufactured a life and death situation, and that had its intended effect. And so I think that there's definitely a genetically innate psychology that, and Jonathan Haidt was one of the first people to really call attention to it in his work on the righteous mind, when he calls it the hive mind, and so on. So I think that we're just kind of beginning to apprehend what that what that's like. And there's a literature on it that I'll try to find time to get some notes here. And it harkens back to social psychology of a century ago, that actually, you know, before the onset of individualism, then a lot of the fathers of social psychology and sociology and the social sciences were onto that. We have your minimal group experiments and things like that. So there's a kind of a combination of old and new. The metaphor of society as an organism is old, old, old. Goes all the way back to the Greeks, and now we're able to kind of brush it off and give it a new look, basically based on multi-level selection.